The palace had known its fair share of secrets, but none had ever pierced the heart of the monarchy quite like this. 4 years, Camilla had quietly carved out her space among royalty, transforming from controversial mistress to Queen Consort. Yet behind the regal titles and polished appearances, something far more calculated had been unfolding. A plan so intricate, so buried in layers of charm and manipulation, that even those closest to her never suspected a thing. Until now. King Charles, long believed to be unwavering in his loyalty to Camilla, had begun to sense a shift, not just in public sentiment, but within his own home. The air in the palace had grown thick with tension. Staff who once worked seamlessly now operated with unease, exchanging glances in corridors, lowering their voices as they passed through gilded halls. Rumors had begun trickling in from trusted aides and longtime friends. At first, Charles dismissed them as baseless gossip, the kind of noise that followed any monarch. But a pattern soon emerged, one too consistent to ignore. Behind closed doors, Camilla had been meeting with individuals outside the official chain of command. Not diplomats or advisors, but influential businessmen, media executives, and private consultants. Documents were circulated without approval, decisions made in his name that never reached his desk. It started small, unauthorized charity partnerships, questionable estate deals, but it grew. She was cultivating power in the shadows, shaping narratives that positioned her as the true strategic mind behind the crown. Charles, ever the traditionalist, was not quick to act. He'd endured scandal, criticism, and national upheaval in his lifetime. But this wasn't about optics or public relations. This was personal. He began launching quiet inquiries, deploying aides he trusted implicitly, retracing every unusual step Camilla had taken over the past 5 years. What they found was staggering. Hidden bank accounts linked to property developments in her name. A shell organization funneling funds from palace contracts into private ventures. Manipulation of royal messaging, designed to elevate her standing while diminishing that of other senior royals. It wasn't just ambition. It was calculated control. What shook Charles most was the revelation that Camilla had been actively working to distance him from certain members of his own family. Correspondence between her and select courtiers showed efforts to isolate Prince William, erode his influence, and subtly question his readiness for the throne. Even Queen Elizabeth's memory had been manipulated, documents altered or hidden, selective reinterpretation of her final wishes, all to secure Camilla's lasting grip on power. The king's mother had trusted her, and that trust had been betrayed. The final blow came with the discovery of a private dossier Camilla had commissioned. It contained detailed psychological profiles of key royals, including Charles himself, assessing their weaknesses, triggers, and how they could be leveraged to maintain control. The cold professionalism of the document, paired with her handwritten notes in the margins, painted a chilling picture. This was not a loyal consort. This was a strategist orchestrating her rise at the expense of the very institution she vowed to serve. Charles, devastated and humiliated, retreated for days. No public appearances. No statements. Just the silence of a man grappling with betrayal from the person he trusted most. The royal household moved into crisis mode. Legal teams were summoned. Confidential briefings took place in the dead of night. Senior royals were informed discreetly, William, Catherine, Princess and, all stunned, all furious. The crown's credibility was at risk, but more than that, the family itself had been violated. Then came the decision. Swift, unforgiving, irrevocable. Camilla was to be stripped of all royal privileges, titles, and access. She was to vacate all palatial residences within the week. Security details were retracted. Her staff dismissed. Every trace of her influence was methodically erased. The palace released a carefully worded statement to the public, citing a need for structural and ethical realignment within the monarchy. They did not mention her by name, but the silence spoke volumes. The world was stunned. Newspapers scrambled to piece together the fallout. Commentators speculated endlessly. Some defended Camilla, calling the move harsh and unjust. Others pointed to her long, controversial path to royalty as evidence of a woman who had always played by her own rules. But within the palace walls, there was no doubt. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Charles re-emerged days later, noticeably aged, his composure brittle but intact. His first public appearance was at a memorial garden dedicated to Queen Elizabeth, a gesture both symbolic and deliberate. With him stood Prince William and Princess Catherine, a united front projecting continuity and resilience. Absent was the woman who had once stood beside him, her image already being removed from official portraits and palace displays. Behind the scenes, the monarchy began restructuring. Every committee Camilla had influenced was reviewed. Every appointee scrutinized. Charles initiated a sweeping internal audit of royal finances and operations. William was entrusted with greater responsibilities, signaling a fast-track transition of power. Trust, once shattered, had to be rebuilt piece by piece. Camilla, meanwhile, retreated to her private estate in Wiltshire, shielded from the press but not from disgrace. She had no legal claim to the title she had lost, and without the palace's backing, her influence dwindled overnight. Former allies distanced themselves. Invitations vanished. The aristocratic circles that once embraced her now turned cold. Even those who had once defended her saw the truth in the palace's silence. The ban was comprehensive and permanent. No return for ceremonies, jubilees, or private family events. She was not to be mentioned in official briefings or documents. Her chapter, once so dominant, was closed with finality. And yet, the damage lingered. The public's trust had been shaken. The monarchy, though enduring, stood on fractured ground. Charles had learned too late the cost of ignoring subtle warnings, of mistaking loyalty for love. The betrayal had not just been personal, it had been constitutional. A breach of the sacred trust that held centuries of tradition together. The younger royals bore the burden of recovery. Catherine emerged as a symbol of poise and purpose, stepping into a more visible role to reassure the public. William, more reserved, took to behind-the-scenes leadership with his father's cautious blessing. Even Harry, though estranged, extended olive branches. Quiet discussions began between brothers long at odds. The shadow Camilla left behind had, in a strange way, forced a reckoning, and perhaps a path forward. But for Charles, healing came slowly. He spent more time in Balmoral, walking the same hills his mother had loved, seeking clarity where there were once only questions. Letters were written, archives reviewed, and in moments of solitude, he faced the hardest truth of all, that love, when left unchecked by scrutiny, can become a blindfold. The press eventually moved on, drawn to newer scandals and fresher headlines. But the Camilla affair remained a cautionary tale, an enduring lesson in how power, when pursued in secret, can unravel even the most revered institutions. Royal biographers began reworking chapters. Documentaries re-edit segments. The legacy she had once crafted with such care was now reduced to a scandal no title could ever cleanse. Within the palace, her name was never spoken aloud. But her absence was felt, in protocols changed, in security tightened, in the wary glances exchanged among those who remembered. The monarchy had survived, but it would never forget. Months passed, but the chill left by Camilla's departure lingered in the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace. Though every trace of her had been removed, the silence she left behind seemed to echo louder than any scandal. Staff walked with quieter steps, conversations remained cautious, and trust, once the invisible glue that held the royal household together, had become a fragile, fractured thing. King Charles, though back in his official capacity, was no longer the same man. Grief had marked him before, with the loss of Princess Diana, the passing of Queen Elizabeth, the estrangement of his youngest son, but this was different. This was a betrayal he could neither deny nor distance himself from. It had taken root inside his reign, inside his private sanctum. He had not just been deceived, he had allowed the deception to thrive under the illusion of devotion. The monarchy, now under intense public scrutiny, leaned into transparency as a means of restoration. Financial disclosures became routine. Royal engagements were documented with unprecedented clarity. The public was invited to see not just the glittering surface of royal life, but the machinery behind it, the protocols, the planning, the costs. This was no longer the era of veiled tradition. It was, by necessity, the age of accountability. Prince William stepped up with measured determination. He was not his father. Where Charles had often been led by emotion and personal loyalty, William favored pragmatism. He surrounded himself with advisors from diverse backgrounds, rejected the more archaic customs, and embraced digital platforms to communicate directly with the public. Catherine became more than a royal figurehead. She was the anchor, the quiet powerhouse restoring faith one careful step at a time. But within the family, the wounds remained raw. Charles had grown distant, even from those closest to him. His trust, once given freely, was now guarded. He reviewed every document personally, questioned every proposal, no matter how small. Some interpreted this as micromanagement, but those who truly understood him recognized the underlying fear. Never again would he allow deception to fester in his presence. The Royal Council, once merely ceremonial, gained unprecedented authority. Composed of senior royals and trusted legal advisors, it functioned as a safeguard, a mechanism to ensure no single individual could dominate internal affairs. The crown, once vulnerable to influence through personal connections, now belonged to an institution of checks and balances. It was Charles's way of protecting what remained of the monarchy, even if it meant curbing his own power. Meanwhile, Camilla lived in almost complete isolation. Gone were the days of luxury and public admiration. Though she retained personal wealth, the prestige that had once elevated her every movement had evaporated. Her name, once spoken with a mix of curiosity and caution, had become a symbol of manipulation. She made no public statements, no interviews, no attempts at rehabilitation. Whether by strategy or shame, she faded from the spotlight entirely. Journalists attempted to trace her steps. Some found evidence of trips abroad, where she tried to stay under the radar. A few reports claimed she was working on a memoir, one that would reveal her side of the story. But if such a manuscript existed, it never surfaced. Publishers kept their distance. Any association with the scandal was deemed toxic. She had lost her titles, her influence, and most of all, her relevance. In private, the royal family struggled with the deeper questions her betrayal had raised. How had they allowed her to rise unchecked? Why had they ignored the warnings, the subtle red flags? The palace, long trained to preserve legacy over introspection, was forced into a rare period of self-examination. Committees were formed to review past decisions. Senior aides were rotated or dismissed entirely. The very culture of loyalty that had once protected Camilla was redefined, stripped of blind allegiance. And yet, for all the reforms, for all the renewed energy from William and Catherine, a shadow remained. Not everyone believed the official story. Conspiracy theories flourished online. Some claimed Camilla had been framed. Others insisted that Charles had known all along and had chosen to act only when it served his legacy. The lack of formal charges, the palace's carefully sanitized statements, all fed into a narrative that refused to die. But inside the monarchy, clarity had been achieved. Camilla's actions had not only undermined the institution, they had placed the entire royal succession at risk. Her influence over estate dealings, media control, and even diplomatic decisions had gone beyond personal ambition. It had threatened the constitutional neutrality that the monarchy was sworn to uphold. Charles, in his pain, had finally drawn a boundary he should have drawn years earlier. For William and Catherine, the challenge was now generational. They were tasked not only with recovering public trust, but with ensuring that such manipulation could never take root again. They began cultivating a new model of monarchy, leaner, more engaged with the public, more transparent. Rather than royal mystique, they emphasized accessibility. Rather than distance, they chose presence. The people responded. Approval ratings began to climb. Young Britons, long disillusioned with royal traditions, started to pay attention again. Harry, watching from afar, remained publicly silent. Privately, it was said he sent letters to his father, not out of glee or vindication, but a kind of solemn recognition. He, too, had warned of internal rot. And while his path had diverged from the crown's, the Camilla scandal proved that not all grievances had been misplaced. For a brief moment, the distance between him and William seemed to shrink. Not with reconciliation, but with understanding. Charles continued to reign, but with a new kind of dignity, one born from failure, not triumph. He no longer sought admiration. He no longer defended his past. He simply worked, day by day, ceremony by ceremony, trying to rebuild what had been nearly lost. The monarchy he now led was less gilded, less invincible, but perhaps more real. Camilla's story became a cautionary tale studied by royal historians, not for its drama, but for its implications. It demonstrated how influence, when cloaked in charm and trust, could alter the course of a nation's history. It forced questions that had long been buried beneath crowns and scepters. Who watches the monarchy? Who protects it when it cannot protect itself? No one dared to speak of her openly. At family gatherings, her name was avoided entirely. Photographs were removed from archives. Items she had favored in royal collections were quietly placed into storage. In time, new chapters were written. New scandals emerged. But those who had lived through it, who had watched the quiet ascent of a woman who was never meant to rule, never forgot. Even years later, when Charles's reign began to wind down, and preparations for William's ascension intensified, the events that led to Camilla's fall remained a stark line in the palace's unofficial timeline. Everything was categorized as before or after her exile. The legacy of that decision, bold, painful, necessary, echoed in every meeting, every reform, every cautious appointment. The palace, once seen as untouchable, had nearly fallen prey to manipulation from within. That it survived at all was a testament not to its grandeur, but to the resilience of the few who had chosen truth over comfort. In its survival, however, came a cost. The loss of innocence, the end of assumption that love and loyalty were always aligned. Camilla, somewhere far from the palace gates, lived out her days in obscurity. No interviews, no apologies, no resurgence. Just silence. Whether out of regret or calculation, no one knew. But the monarchy had moved on, scarred, hardened, but still standing. And in the centuries to come, when historians chronicled the reign of Charles III, they would speak of the betrayal that nearly broke him. Not as a tabloid headline, but as a turning point. The moment when the crown stopped trusting blindly and began protecting itself, not from outside threats, but from the ones who had once worn it. For more interesting stories from the royal palace, like and subscribe the channel.